everybody, welcome back to the video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video we're going to take a more detailed look at the arguments of Plato's Euthyphro. And let's recall to ourselves where we left off. So in the previous video we discussed how Socrates and Euthyphro find themselves in this discussion outside the courthouse where they both have business later on. In Euthyphro's case, he is prosecuting his father for the charge of murder. And importantly, he's claiming as justification that this is the pious thing to do. What does that in general mean? Well, we're going to discuss that in more detail here, but basically what it means is this is something that would be pleasing to the gods. Socrates, on the other hand, has a sort of parallel but different situation. He's a defendant. He's going to be facing charges, and one of the accusations made against him is that of impiety. The charge is that he invents gods and doesn't follow or worship the gods of the state. Now, why this matters is because this makes the nature of piety itself a central point in discussion. If Socrates is going to defend himself against the charge of piety, and maybe more importantly, if Euthyphro is going to say his father is impious, then he should have some idea of what piety is. And what we find in the beginning of the dialogue is that Euthyphro expresses a great deal of confidence that he knows exactly what piety is. So much confidence, in fact, that he feels he's able to do something most people would find shocking. That is, prosecute his own father for murder. So Socrates sarcastically, I think, says, well, great, you will be a great resource to me. Since I'm also facing charges of impiety, I can use you to determine what it is, then I can defeat my enemies in court. Now, does Socrates really think that Euthyphro is a expert in piety? Well, no, and as we'll see, he's about to take apart the various definitions that Euthyphro provides. So let's see how he does that. And basically, the main part of this dialogue, what happens is Euthyphro provides three different definitions of piety, and Socrates explains why they're all misguided. In this video, we're going to look at the first two definitions he provides. So let's look at Euthyphro's first attempt to define piety. Socrates says, tell me then, what is the pious and impious? How do you define it? Euthyphro says, I say that the pious is to do what I'm doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else. Whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else, not to prosecute is impious. Okay, so what has Euthyphro done here? He's essentially told Socrates, well, the pious thing to do is what I'm doing right now. The pious thing to do is to prosecute the wrongdoer, no matter what the crime is, no matter what the situation is. Okay, now, maybe Euthyphro is right about that, maybe he's not. But the first question we should ask ourselves is, Socrates asks Euthyphro for a definition of piety. He asked him for an explanation that would help someone who had no idea what piety is better understand it. And the question we should ask ourselves is, does Euthyphro's first definition, does it help us have any better sort of understanding of what piety actually is? Well, what has he done? He's given an example of something he takes to be pious, namely, prosecuting a wrongdoer. But can you define a concept by simply giving an example of it? Socrates apparently doesn't seem to think so, because he goes on to criticize Euthyphro, and he says, you did not adequately teach me what the pious was, but you told me what you're doing now, prosecuting your father. And a little farther down he says, and this is the critical point, I did not bid you to tell me one or two of the many pious actions. Because notice he gave one example, prosecuting a wrongdoer. Well, aren't there other things that might be pious? Maybe helping those in need, maybe making proper sacrifices to the gods, maybe praying, maybe all these things are pious too. So why are you just focusing on this one example? So he says, I didn't want you to tell me here are a few examples of pious actions, but here's the critical part. Socrates says, I want you to tell me the form itself that makes all pious actions pious. So what is Socrates asking here? He's asking for the essence of piety. He's asking, what if you think of all the various pious actions you can imagine, making a sacrifice to the gods, praying, helping a person in need, prosecuting a wrongdoer, Suppose we say that all those things are pious. What is it about them that makes them similar? What is it about all those things that makes it so that it makes sense to group them under the same name of piety? And this is ultimately the reason why Socrates thinks his first definition fails, because it's not even a definition. Socrates again continues, "Tell me then what this form itself of piety is, so that I may look upon it and using it as a model, say that any action of yours or another's is of that kind is pious." So what he wants is not one example of piety, he wants a basic form or model of piety that I can use to say, okay, that's a pious action, that's an impious action. And notice, this is exactly the kind of knowledge you would want to become an expert in piety. If you really understand what piety is, or understand what any fundamental concept is, you don't just know a few examples of it. You know how to identify it when you see it because you know what its true essence or definition is. I think this point can best be made by looking at an example. So here's a parallel discussion. Let's say Socrates and Euthyphro were having a philosophical discussion about the definition of triangle. Now this wouldn't be all that interesting of a discussion because we all know what a triangle is, right? A triangle is a closed three-sided figure in which all the interior angles add up to 180 degrees. But let's just say they were having that discussion nonetheless. So Socrates says, what is a triangle? And Euthyphro says, okay, here's my definition, and he points to a triangle. Okay. Now that shows some understanding of what a triangle is. It's good you can identify one example. But we haven't really got to the heart of the matter. Because by you pointing to one triangle doesn't show me you actually understand what it is. It doesn't mean you could identify more triangles. It might just mean that someone one day gave you this triangle and said, this is a triangle. Someone just pointed this out to you as an example. But it is far from making you an expert in triangleness. And of course the reason that matters is because Euthyphro was going on in the beginning of the dialogue about how he's so confident in his understanding of piety that he's willing to prosecute his own father for murder. And if he's going to be that confident, he should be an expert in piety. He shouldn't just say, here are some examples. He should say, here's the definition. Just like an expert in triangles can say that it's a closed three-sided figure where the interior angles add up to 180 degrees, he should be able to give that precise definition of what piety is, and that's what Socrates is looking for. So ultimately, Euthyphro's first definition fails, and it fails because it just is not even a definition at all. Alright. But Euthyphro says, okay, well let me give you a second attempt. Let me try a second definition. Now, so here's Euthyphro's second definition. He says, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious. Okay. And another way to think about this is he'll talk about it, use this word later on. Euthyphro understands piety to be whatever the gods love, and impiety to be whatever the gods hate. So here are some examples of gods in the tradition of Greek mythology: Zeus, Cronus, Uranus, Hephaestus, Hera, etc. There are many more, but here are some examples. And what Euthyphro was saying is that whatever these individuals love, that's what's pious, and whatever they hate, that's what's impious. Okay, a couple points to make here. First, this at least gives us a clear sense of how we'll know whether what Euthyphro is doing is pious or impious. What we would need to determine is, do the gods love prosecuting your father for murder in this circumstance, or do they hate it? If they love it, he's doing the right thing, it's pious. If they hate it, he's doing the wrong thing, it's impious. Okay. We should also notice Socrates' reaction here. He says, "Splendid, Euthyphro, you have now answered in the way I wanted." Now, why does he say this? Is he accepting his definition? Well, no, as we see, he thinks there are some problems with it. But at least this is a definition. Right? He's given a general explanation of piety. Whatever the gods love is pious, whatever the gods hate is impious. To the extent that we can know what the gods love and hate, we would now have expert knowledge of piety. We would be able to identify a pious action and an impious action. He hasn't just given Socrates an example of piety. Now, as Socrates notes, he says, we're not really sure whether what you've said is true or not, but now that's what we have to examine. Okay, so we have this basic definition of piety. The pious is what the gods love, the impious is what the gods hate. Now, as we're going to see, Socrates rejects this definition as well. And to understand how he goes about rejecting this definition, you have to understand the basic form of argument that he uses. In philosophy, the form of argument that Socrates uses to reject this argument, to reject Euthro's definition, is called a Reductio ad Absurdum argument. Okay, so how do such arguments work? Here's the basic structure. First, you make some assumption. You assume that something is true just for the sake of argument. I mean, you've probably done this all the time. You're having an argument with a friend, and they say something that doesn't seem right to you, and you say, well, okay, let's just assume for the sake of argument you're right. Now, what are you doing when you just say assume for the sake of argument? You're not saying that's correct. You're saying, let's imagine that were true. And the reason you're imagining it's true is because you want to see what follows from it. If I accept this thing you're saying right now, what would the consequence be? So a reductio ad absurdum argument form begins by making some sort of assumption for the sake of argument. Then, by further argumentation, it shows that some contradiction follows. So your friend, you say, okay, I'm going to assume what you're saying is true. Then, by further argumentation, you show that that thing your friend thinks is true, and now we're assuming, it leads to a logical contradiction. If we think that assumption A is true, then, for instance, P and not P would both have to be the case. That thing you're saying would lead to a direct logical contradiction. But we can't have a logical contradiction. It's not possible for P and not P to be true at the same time. That's just a straight contradiction in terms. So therefore, the reductio ad absurdum argument says, well, that initial assumption must be false. If that assumption leads to a contradiction, then we have to get rid of the assumption. We know the assumption that we started with must be false. This form of argument is called reductio ad absurdum. It's just Latin for reduced to absurdity. You're taking your opponent's position and you're reducing it to some absurd consequence. And that's exactly what Socrates is going to do here. He's going to assume that Euthro's second definition of piety is true. And then he's going to show how a contradiction follows from it, so that must not be the right definition. Okay, so that's the general form. Let's see what the argument actually looks like. And I've got it outlined here. So I'm just going to go step by step through this. So you see the first line of the argument I have labeled as A. That just means assumption. So first Socrates says, I'm going to assume you're right. I'm going to assume your second definition of piety. Let's assume for the sake of argument that if the gods love something, it's pious, and if the gods hate something, then it's impious. Okay, so we'll imagine Euthyphro is right. Now the first claim he makes to show how this leads to a contradiction is that the gods fight angrily with one another. And this is something that Euthyphro himself accepts, right? So we see Socrates saying here, we've also stated that the gods are in a state of discord, that they're at odds with each other, Euthyphro, and that they're at enmity with each other. Now Socrates is just really referring to a lot of stories about the gods at the time. In Greek mythology, the gods didn't always get along. They sometimes engaged in rather angry, even violent conflict. And in fact, Euthyphro himself references such a story earlier in the dialogue. He says, and observe Socrates, I can cite powerful evidence that the law is so. I've already said to others that such actions are right, the ones he's taking. These people themselves believe that Zeus is the best and most just of the gods, yet they agree that he bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons, and that he in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. So he tells this classic story, which is part of Greek mythology, in which the father of Zeus unjustly swallowed his sons, and he in turn castrated his father. Now this is obviously conflict of a very sort of violent sort, a very angry sort. Obviously the gods are not always getting along. And what's being referred to here is this famous event in Greek mythology called the Titan Wars, which is depicted in a famous painting that I also have as the picture for this lesson. So the first claim really just is that the gods fight angrily with one another. And Euthyphro accepts that fully. In this quote, we see Socrates is actually somewhat skeptical about that, but he puts that aside. All that matters here is that Euthyphro believes that the gods fight angrily with one another. Okay, now the next question you have to ask yourself is, if the gods fight angrily with one another, well, why? What could be causing them to fight angrily? I'm sure you've had an angry fight with someone in your life. I'm sure that's not a completely foreign experience to you. So what are the sorts of things that don't just cause conflict, but cause angry conflict? Right? And the claim that Socrates wants to make is, well, look, if the gods are fighting angrily with one another, then they must have a disagreement. But not just any disagreement. They must disagree on what is good and bad. Now, why is this? Well, let's go through the reasoning. Socrates says, what are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Because look, there can be a lot of things that divide you from other people in terms of opinion. Right? There's all sorts of situations in which you see the world one way, other people see it a different way, but you don't actually fight or get angry about each other. Angry with each other. And Socrates gives some examples of this. He said, look, let's look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers, to which is greater, would this make us enemies? No. Like, if we weren't sure about which number was the larger one or smaller one, we would simply consult our knowledge of mathematics. What if we saw an object, or two objects in the distance, and we weren't sure which one was larger or which one was smaller? You thought one was the larger one, I thought the other one was the larger one. Would that really cause us to be enemies and fight each other angrily? Well, not if we're at all mature. Socrates says we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ. The same about things that are heavier or lighter. We would resort to weighing and then we'd be okay. So there's certain things you can disagree on that aren't really going to cause you to be up in arms, not going to cause you to engage in angry conflict. Okay, but what are the things that do cause angry conflict? Socrates says the following. What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine as I tell you whether these subjects are the just and unjust, the beautiful and ugly, the good and bad. So he mentions justice, beauty, and goodness. These are the subjects about which we fight. And there's a reason in the argument I outline these as all just being about goodness and badness, because when we're talking about whether something's just or unjust, we're applying some standard to something, and if it's just, we say it's a good thing. If it's unjust, it's a bad thing. Same with beautiful. Like, beautiful things are seen as good, ugly things are seen as bad. So his point is that when you fight angrily with someone, usually it's because you think that there's something about goodness or badness that's at stake. That's the thing. Those are the things that really get us riled up. And to see this point, let's consider the following cases. Right? So, case 1. Ryan and Rachel disagree about how tall LeBron James is. Ryan thinks LeBron James is more than 7 feet tall, whereas Rachel believes LeBron James is less than 7 feet tall. Okay, now, this is kind of like the disagreements about, weight or number or size, right? It's really the sort of disagreement that you could easily solve by using Google, right? And of course, it would turn out in this case that Ryan would be incorrect and Rachel would be correct. LeBron James is less than 7 feet tall, and it's an easy dispute to solve, so we don't need to fight angrily with one another. But compare that to 2, 3, and 4. Case 2. Ryan and Rachel disagree about whether LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time. Ryan believes James is the greatest. Rachel believes James is not. Ryan and Rachel disagree about whether the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci is the most beautiful painting. Ryan believes it truly is the most beautiful, whereas Rachel believes The Starry Night by Van Gogh is the most beautiful. Ryan and Rachel disagree about whether non-violent drug offenders should be given prison sentences. Imagine hypothetically that Ryan believes that non-violent drug offenders should be given prison sentences, whereas Rachel believes they should not be. Now, I would submit to you that maybe not for every person, maybe not for everyone, but for many people, or for certain people, cases 2 through 4 would be the sort of things you would go to the mat on, potentially argue about in an angry way. And you might look at case 2 and you might say, well, I mean, that's just about like your opinion about sports. Like, why would someone get so angry about it? That's an excellent question. But it is also the case that people do get angry about that sort of thing. And of course, what's at stake? Well, some standard of goodness or badness. A standard about who's the best basketball player. Now, I'm not personally the sort of person that would get angry about what is the most beautiful painting, but I'm sure many people who are very into paintings probably have their favorites. And I could imagine people angrily, or at least spiritedly, arguing about whether the Mona Lisa or the Starry Night or some other painting is the most beautiful. And I don't think it takes any stretch of the imagination to argue, to see people or imagine them arguing angrily about something like case 4, a moral or political issue. Take an issue like a policy on drugs, abortion, or the death penalty. Any of these issues are going to divide people into different camps, different sides, and you'll see people fighting very angrily over them. And just like case 2 and case 3, right? Case 2, we have a standard of athletic excellence. Case 3, a standard of beauty. Case 4, a standard of justice or morality or ethics. All of these focus on matters of goodness or badness. And so the thing to think about here is, why is it that those are the sorts of things that would cause you to react and argue angrily? Now, the first thing I would say is that actually it shouldn't. One of the points I made, I won't belabor here, that I went over in the very first video in this series, was the sort of attitude you should take toward argument. And you shouldn't see it as a personal thing. And ideally, you wouldn't be angry at those who disagree with you. You would just look at the evidence and evaluate it dispassionately and come to a rational decision. Of course, that's not how people act. So it's worth thinking about here, why is it these sorts of things cause angry engagement? And I think it's to a large extent because people don't do that. Right? People see these sorts of disputes as being part of their identity, who they are. I mean, look at sports fans. The word fan literally comes from the word fanatic. People wear the colors associated with their team. They go through cult-like rituals of chants. People really do display fanaticism about their sports teams. Politics and morals also divide us similarly. You're a Republican, you're a Democrat, right? You believe this on abortion or that on abortion. You're pro-life, you're pro-choice. We have different names for different public policy positions. We have different political parties. This divides people into different groups, and people take that as part of their identity when arguing. Such that when we argue about a matter where a standard of goodness or badness is at stake, and what you think about is part of who you about that issue, is part of who you are, it's part of your self-conception. When someone disagrees with you, you feel like they're not just attacking your beliefs, they're attacking you. And they feel similarly. That at least is my speculation as to why there is so much angry dispute about these things. But let's remember the context of the argument. So we see Socrates saying, look, if the gods fight angrily, they must disagree on what's good and bad. This puts the gods of the Greek mythology in a very specific sort of, we have to view them with a very specific sort of perspective. They have the passions and all the weaknesses of human beings. They fight angrily about standards of goodness and badness and take them to be part of their identity. Okay, so that's the second premise. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that the gods fight about what's good and bad? Well, The third premise is, if the gods disagree on what's good and bad, then the same thing can be loved by some gods and hated by others. Socrates says different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good, and bad, for they would not be at odds with one another unless they differed about these subjects, would they? And they like what each of them considers beautiful, good, and just, and hate the opposites. So this seems pretty clear. If the gods disagree on what's good and bad, then you'd find some gods loving one thing and some hating the other, and some hating that same thing. And now apply that to this same case. Euthyphro says, I'm prosecuting my father, and the reason I know it's the right thing to do is because it's the pious thing to do. And the pious thing to do is whatever the gods love. Well, luckily for Euthyphro, we can imagine that maybe some gods do love what he's doing. But also, since the gods fight angrily with one another, it also might be the case that many other gods hate what he's doing. So where does that put Euthyphro's claim that he's doing the pious thing? It puts it on some shaky ground. Because notice the first conclusion we draw here. From all these points, from Euthyphro's definition, we would have to draw the consequence that the same thing can be both pious and impious. Euthyphro's act of prosecuting his father would be pious, it would be a good thing. Oh, it's also impious, it's also a bad thing. But as I explained earlier, and this is the strategy of Reductio ad Absurdum, the same thing can't be both pious and impious. That's just a logical contradiction. So the conclusion Socrates draws is that the initial definition must be incorrect. It just must be incorrect that we can simply say that what the gods love is pious and what the gods hate is impious. Euthyphro's second definition also fails because it leads to a direct contradiction. Now, I want to make one final point, a more general point about this argument. First, we can see how this is a rather big problem for Euthyphro. Because what he's trying to do is say, look, my behavior is acceptable because I'm pointing to a group of moral experts, namely the gods. And they would approve of what I'm doing, so I must be doing the right thing. Well, but now we've seen that supposed group of moral experts very likely and often do disagree with one another. And so what this has shown is, if there's some group of individuals who you want to treat as moral experts or guides for what you should do for how to live your life, and they can't agree with one another on what the right thing to do is, then they're not, that's not a very good group of experts. Think about this in another context. Let's say you have some illness and you want to know what you should do. So you go to one doctor, that doctor prescribes one medication. You go to another doctor for a second opinion. That doctor says, no, don't take that. It'll be horribly dangerous. Try this medication. You go to a third doctor. They say, no, neither of those two know what they're talking about. Don't take any medication at all. Just let it naturally take its course. Now, in this case, we don't have to think that these doctors are quacks, right? We can imagine that they all went to medical school, that they all know what they're talking about. But it just might be the case that on this particular question, there isn't a consensus among medical professionals. We just don't know enough yet. So even in that case, where there's legitimate experts who disagree, if the disagreement is wide enough, it might be a good cause for you to say, well, maybe I should sort of withhold judgment. We don't maybe really know the answer here yet. But now look at it even from a broader perspective, because I think underlying these arguments, Socrates wants to make a broader political point. Can you think about another context or situation in which we treat some group of individuals who disagree radically with one another as authoritative or as a sort of expert? Well, Socrates here would point to democracy. Think about how democracy works. You have a large group of people who disagree radically on the direction the country or a community should go. So how do we resolve this sort of disagreement? We vote on what should be done, and we let the majority rule the day. Now, notably, especially in a modern society, almost nobody in society can really be seen as an expert on what should be done. I mean, think about the amount of knowledge you would have to really be an expert on what policies should be put in place. You have to be an expert in political science, economics, international affairs, law. I mean, the amount of subjects and knowledge you would have to be an expert is just staggering. So nobody in a democratic society is an expert. And not only that, everyone in a democratic society disagrees with one another. Radically disagrees, in fact. And so what Socrates sees here is a sort of larger version of just what Euthyphro is doing. Socrates is not a big fan of democracy, and to a large extent this is why. He sees the process of democracy as putting our confidence, our trust, in a large group of people who don't have proper expertise about what should be done. And we already know you can't treat a group as a moral expert or as a moral authority if they all disagree with one another. So Socrates' point isn't just about Euthyphro, although it is about that. It's also about his larger critique of democracy, and that larger critique of democracy as a sort of mob rule by non-experts is something that's going to continue to come up in also the Apology and the Crito. Okay, so I'll stop there. I hope the video was helpful and enjoyable, and I will see you in the next one.